welcome to, and I'm not sure, Tom, I see Alan's face here, and I know we'll want to get to Menachem's, but I'm not sure if everybody else is seeing that, but thank you, Alan. It's nice to see you. Hello. Welcome to Hebrew Seminary's 2021 Spirituality Series, Jewish Mysticism, Making It Real for Your Life. Hebrew Seminary has created a new series of webinars led by our esteemed seminary faculty, and they're designated to explore the really remarkable and enduring wisdom of Judaism and Jewish mysticism in ways you've probably never thought about it. And we want to offer pathways for people to navigate these times, these unprecedented times, not to mention your future. And since our founding in 1992, for those of you who aren't familiar with the seminary, it's been an inclusive and egalitarian community, so important to us in both teaching our students and in all of the programming offered. We offered our students to become rabbis and Jewish educators to serve Jewish communities, including the deaf community. And we also offer special education for the public at large, for you, so please, I'll mention again later, look at our website. We want to give special recognition and gratitude to our extraordinary founder and president, Rabbi Dr. Douglas Goldhammer, who gave the first of this series, if you were fortunate enough to see it. And by the way, if you didn't, you can see it on YouTube. For those of you familiar with the seminary, thank you for being here. And for those of you who are new, we're grateful that you are here, because this virtual opportunity, because of the pandemic, allows us to reach a broader audience than we may have on Oakton Street. So thank you so much. I'm Nancy Rothstein, and I am your moderator for this series and a member of the board of Hebrew Seminary. Tonight is the second of our series, and with Rabbi Menachem Cohen, AKA Rabbi Menachem. And before I introduce him, I want to give a few Zoom guidelines to make your experience tonight all the easier and good. So this is what's called a Zoom meeting versus a webinar. So everybody can see everybody's pictures. And so it's also being recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, then just turn your video off. That said, in all respect to Rabbi Menachem, he wants to see you. So seriously consider leaving your video on. Please put any questions you have, or comments for that matter, in the chat. There isn't a Q&A on this feature. So your questions we will get to towards the end, but please put them there. And your mics are muted just to make sure that we can all hear Rabbi Menachem. And I want to introduce you to our extraordinary ASL interpreter, Kathy Silvern, who's signing this evening. And for those following Kathy, hello. Feel free to use the gallery view rather than the speaker view, and that you'll find in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. In addition, if you want to see Kathy's video larger, you can do what's pin it, and there's a 3 dots at the top right corner of her image, and you select pin video, and you can do it on the speaker's video too if you want to see Rabbi Menachem really big, which you can right now. So let me introduce you to our gifted speaker. Rabbi Menachem Cohen is a spiritual director, rabbi, and tabletop game designer who has played role-playing games, aka RPGs, for 40+ years. Much of his work is in the design and use of games for spiritual work and addressing existential questions, which he does a really good job of. He received his rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Seminary in 2003 and is currently professor of spirituality and a member of its board of directors. The Forward selected him as one of America's most inspiring rabbis in 2016. This evening, Rabbi Menachem will be speaking about Dungeons, Dragons, and Divinity, playing games for spiritual growth, exploration, and healing. Many of you here this evening are familiar with gaming. Some of you aren't. I surely was not. But I'm entranced because whether you play regularly or have yet to partake, when we play the genre of games for which Rabbi Menachem is an expert, you engage in a transformative space referred to as the magic circle, using role playing to invoke transformation. And that being for yourself with a capital S, for your life and even your relationships. Ever the teacher, Rabbi Cohen will provide definitions for context, including, which is a really good one to get, the definition of spirituality. As he expressed to me, with games, we can explore how to address who you are in the world. Rabbi will share compelling stories, including a fascinating one about King David, to illuminate how games can advance your spiritual growth and your healing today. Rabbi Menachem, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction. We don't have a lot of time, but I always like to start anything that's remotely spiritual or not with a little meditation. So I'm going to do a super short meditation, right? So not as long as I normally would do it, but I want to invite you just to let your breathing settle into your abdomen, get a little solidity to your seat, a little elevation to your spine, not to be straight up and down, but just a little reach. Maybe roll your shoulders or stretch your arms out if that helps loosen up. And really try and use the fullness of your lungs as you breathe. Maybe audible exhales. Always feels good to me. I just like to imagine we're taking a hike, and it could be in the whatever climate, whatever setting you love. Take in the smells and the sights and the sounds of your feet on the ground, the birds, maybe there's waves. Let's have a fire. So let's collect a little bit of tinder and kindling and some twigs, some sticks, some logs, and construct the fire. Then take a match, strike it, and light the pine needles or the white birch bark that you found on a fallen log. And watch the flame start to spread, catching the kindling, and the kindling and the tinder, and the twigs and the sticks. Watch the fire dance. This could be Aish Kodesh, holy flame. I like to think it is. And imagine it dance towards you. And without burning you, it starts to lick at your clothes and then come into your body and illuminate you without burning. And as you inhale, the light intensifies. And as you exhale, imagine the light spreading through your body, through your shoulders and your arms and your hands to the tips of your fingers, your neck and head to the crown, the Keter, down your torso, down your hips and waist, thighs, knees, all the way down to your feet, the tips of your toes, in your bones, in your muscles, in your nerves. If you hit any blockages or gunk, imagine sending them out. Our emotional and spiritual scraps are like compost for the divine, for the spiritual. So let it out. See if you can push through any blocks. And let's take a 2 short 30 seconds to sit, imagining ourselves full of this holy fire. That was far too short, but you can remember it being full of this holy fire, this Aish Kodesh. I think it was 1979 when I first played Dungeons and Dragons. My friend Chris brought over what I think was the red box, for those of you familiar with the game. And I've been playing pretty much ever since. I've also started playing other games. I played almost, everything behind me are a lot of my games. I have my Dungeons and Dragons and my zine games. I play everything from indie games people made on their computer and folded and stapled themselves to the big companies, like Dungeons and Dragons. And it was in the 90s. I was playing a second edition Dungeons and Dragons psionicist, person who had mental powers. And he was talking his way out of all sorts of situations, getting out of fights without having to fight. And I was like, that's not me. I'm more quiet. I'm more reserved. I'm not a smooth talker. It's just my character. In academic game studies, we call that alibi. It's not me. It's my character. And then one day it clicked. That is me. I'm the one saying those words that get us out of the fights, get us out of trouble. I realized I was stretching myself and learning new skills. So before I go on, quickly, who here has not played any role-playing games ever? Just kind of raise your hands and hold them up there for a second so I can go to the second screen.
I don't think I ever, yeah.
All right. Or raise your hand on the raise hand option, because if your video is not on. All right. So there's a lot of you have played games, but I just want to say a role-playing game is a game you play with paper and pencil and dice and all these rule books. You can get tons of rule books if you want to. Right now, a lot of it's going online, so people are doing everything digitally, but traditionally you play around a table with people you know or may not know. You go to comic book stores or game shops and play the game, and you create a character and you give that character skills and abilities. You could be a wizard, you could be a warrior, you could be a sneaky thief, you can be a cleric who prays to a god and is given powers and spells and a lot of healing or combat skills. You also give them personality and quirks and backstories. And you usually, there's one person who's the game master or dungeon master, and they kind of set the setting. They tell you where you are and what's happening around you. Though many games now, that kind of stuff is actually done by the group together. It's called world building, and it's done by the group. But traditionally, it's one person who has created a setting. And then they say you walk through the field and you notice a bunch of hyenas feeding on some giant corpse. So what do? And the players say, well, I want to get close and investigate, but I want to sneak up on them. Right. And everyone says, I'm going to run in there because I want to kill those hyenas because I hate hyenas because they killed my family. Whatever it might be. And so you roll dice to determine the outcomes of what you're trying to do. There are other systems, and so you go on and you advance and you get more skills, more powers, more spells. And that's the basics of role-playing games. So after I discovered that I was stretching myself and learning new skills through my gameplay, I slowly and eventually started learning that games are being used in education to build social skills with people. The military has used combat simulation and role-playing games for a long time. Games are also being used in therapeutic environments. Currently, there's a lot of great work being done with young people on the autism spectrum in role-playing games. I found that it's really good work in turn-taking and cooperation and pulling people out of their shells. The research really began in earnest way back in the 80s. D&D was pretty much invented around, I should have wrote down, I believe 74. But even as early as the 80s, John Eric Holmes in 1981 was publishing research, and Gary Allen Fine, who's been teaching Northwestern, had one of the seminal research pieces in 1983. Is continued into current times with books like this one by my friend Sarah Lynn Bowman on the function of role-playing games, which was her master's thesis, or other books like Role-Playing Game Studies, which came out, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And it's a collection of essays about games and sociology, games and therapy, games, and it's called all sorts of different fields. Psychology, literary studies, economics, science and technology. So there's a growing field of academic game designs, game studies. Excuse me. So during this time of me playing games, I ended up going to seminary here at Hebrew Seminary. And when I was ordained in 2003, I started a small community that meets in Chicago called Mitziut, Mitziut. It's still continuing today, despite everything. And when I boil my rabbinate to its core, I am here to be with people on their spiritual journeys, to accompany people as they address their spiritual questions. And knowing and seeing what games could do in these other fields, I started realizing we could use games to learn about ourselves, to stretch, to grow, to answer these spiritual questions. So let me define, excuse me, because I wasn't coughing all day until now. Let me define spirituality. I think of spirituality as questions about meaning and purpose. Who am I? What makes me come alive? Questions about my relationship with the divine. I believe the spiritual impulse precedes religion. The spiritual impulse to know ourselves, to know the divine, was first, and then religion came along and said, hey, here's some good ways to do that. And they work or they don't work. And religions survive a lot based on how much they help people answer these spiritual questions. There is a biblical story, and I was going to talk about this later, but it's coming to me now, about David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. David sees Bathsheba bathing on her roof and decides he wants her. So long story short, he has her husband killed by sending him into battle and with orders to leave him alone to fight for himself. So he dies and they get married. It falls upon Nathan the prophet to come and tell David what a jerk he is. But Nathan doesn't walk in and lecture the king. He walks in and says, Your Majesty, may I tell you a story? David loves stories. He's David, right? He wrote the Psalms. The Psalms are attributed to David. Your Majesty, there was a rich man who had lots of flocks, goats, and ewes. And there was a poor man who had one goat. He loved that goat and treated it like a child. It slept with him in the house and with his family. And then one day the rich man had a wayfarer, a traveler, stop by. Tradition was you feed the wayfarers, and the rich man didn't want to give any of his goats, any of his ewes. So he had the poor man's goats slaughtered. David is incensed at this, and he says, that man should be punished. And Nathan, I always imagine trying not to smile, says, Ata ha'ish, you are the man. And David realizes what he's done. He can't change it, right? Because Uriah is dead, the husband. But he was able to see the truth because he heard a story, and his ego and his defenses didn't go and get in the way. Right? He was able to see truth about defending himself. And I call this fictional distance. It's this fictional distance that allows us, when we're playing a character, to say, it's just my character. It's not me. Right? We can say my character is the one who's dealing with the loss of their family. My character is the one who's dealing with what does it mean to serve a deity. And I have used games in these ways a lot. In the last several years, particularly, I've played characters who were either gender queer, gender indeterminate, intersex, or cross-dressing, cross-gender in all various ways to help me really come to understand what my sense of gender is and what it means to have a gender in this world. I have, as clergy, the question of what it means to serve comes up. So I've played a lot of characters who serve unquestionably, and other characters who serve with lots of doubts and not really fully believing what they're in. So I can play out, what does it feel like to be someone who's serving? I have a very controlled presentation in the world, right? So I've often played characters who let themselves go out of control a lot, often through excessive drug use, right? So I get to play this out without the inherent risks that come with doing such things in real life. Nancy mentioned the magic circle. So part of why this is able to work is based on a concept called the magic circle that was originally mentioned by a man named Johann Huizinga, Huizinga, but really built upon by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman in their Rules of Play book, and then later refuted by Eric Zimmerman, and is a much maligned and questioned concept. But the basic idea is when we play a game, any game, bridge, soccer, Dungeons and Dragons, we enter into a space called the magic circle where the regular rules of life are different, are changed, right? We don't spend our days running around kicking a ball into a goal, trying to find a trump card, or casting fireballs out of our hands, right? So the rules change. Something happens in the game. We win, we lose, we get injured, we get powers and abilities, and then we leave the game transformed. Some little changes happen. It may not be a big deal, but if you lose a soccer game, you leave and you think about what it meant that you lost and why you lost, right? When you leave a game, you maybe have learned something about your character or about yourself. Back in 2014, my friend and colleague David Weasley was getting certified as a spiritual director in the same place I eventually went to. And we were talking a lot. We worked together at the night ministry where I spent 13 years working on the streets with LGBTQ and our homeless youth here in Chicago. And we talked a lot about games. We were geeking out together. And how we could use games. He's a minister, how we could use games. And he decided he would try a little 6-session campaign. A campaign is when you play a series of adventures that fit together. And I was one of the participants in that game, and I learned a lot from what we did there. And I built a lot of my work on that. And eventually I discovered the game Dream Chaser, which you can see the box for here over my shoulder. It was a Kickstarter, I believe, in 2017. And I found the game. And the basic idea of the game, the way it starts, you don't have a setting. I mean, you can have a setting, but usually the best way is you don't have a setting predetermined. So every player gets note cards. And they write on the note cards a goal or a dream. Overthrow the empire, befriend a dragon, live in the woods. And then the group votes on one of them. Let's say they vote on befriend a dragon. That goes in the middle of the dream board. And then each player says, in this game, my role, this is like your character class for those who know games. And so they could say, I'm a hunter tracker. I'm a linguist. I'm an astronaut, the third one says. So now I know there's an astronaut and a dragon in the game somehow. And I enjoy trying to figure out what that means. And then they get to take and write a milestone, something that would be fun for their character to do along the way. And create a magic sword, learn a new language, find my long lost sister. No one gets to veto your choice. And you put those in order around the central dream, and that becomes the adventure map. As soon as I read this game, I was like, you could easily adapt this game to be about personal questions. So I wrote Pete Petruccia, the creator of the game, and I helped edit part of the book. I beta tested the game, and I started running it at conventions. And Pete would get asked by therapists and social workers, how could I use this game one-on-one with my clients? And because of our conversations and our friendship, he brought me on to adapt the game for use in one-on-one work in spiritual direction and therapy. And that's a lot of my work these days. If we have time, I'm going to show you a little more about that when it comes But I got to do my internship. I eventually went to school, the same school my colleague David went to, Loyola University, to get a graduate certificate in spiritual direction. And I did my internship playing these games with some of the youth I was working with on the streets. And then I did get a gig just before a pandemic started, playing a spiritual discovery Dungeons and Dragons game with the young people at the Broadway Youth Center here in Chicago. We only got about 2/3 of the way through. But there were some amazing things, and now I want to share with you some of the things I've learned while doing these games. Like, for example, I did 12 to 15 sessions of one-on-one dream chaser with a young woman who was about 30, early 30s, who was born with a lot of medical issues and was not supposed to have lived, as long as she did. And she had some hearing issues and some vision issues and other medical issues. So she played dream chaser with me, and she made a character who was not herself, who was a 16-year-old blind oracle who had been living by herself since she was like 8, right? And she she played out this character because she had issues a lot with her parents wanting to make decisions for her and a little bit of infantilizing. And so she said her character, and these are things she told me, I'm learning to accept myself as I am. Wait, this is her goal for her character. Learn to accept myself as I am, discover the source of her powers. And some things she told me, people tend to make decisions for me. I'm using my character to ask me, what do I want? Making these decisions is scary. My character is more like this, but doesn't have the fear. What if I was more like this? What if I didn't care what people thought? And then she said that her character's journey is ultimately my journey. I'm starting, God, I wish I could read my own handwriting. I'm taking the process of taking her out and putting me in. She can do things I couldn't, and she allows me more freedom to explore, gives me space to do the things I couldn't or I wouldn't do before. One player I played with was a young African-American man who fit the stereotype of thug in presentation. People would avoid him on the streets, But when we were playing D&D and making characters he had never played before, he said, I was explaining the different classes you could be, and he was like, I want to be a healer. And his friend saying next to him was like, no, you can be a great, powerful warrior, and you can, kick ass and all this stuff. And he's like, he said it several times, no, I want to be a healer. And I wish we had had the time to really play through. I didn't get a chance to finish this, but the beauty of someone saying, I can imagine myself being this thing that people don't see me as. I've also learned that system matters. So I mentioned there's lots of different games. In Dungeons and Dragons, the way you advance and get more powerful is by killing monsters and getting treasure, right? Traditionally, there's other ways you can do it, but the traditional way is to kill and pillage, and that's how you get more powerful. In the Doctor Who role-playing game, based on the popular time-traveling Doctor, there's a system of conflict where the sequence goes, whenever there's conflict, it's first the talkers, then the movers, then the doers, and finally the fighters, right? So the last thing that happens is fighting and conflict. I'm playing a game now called Thirsty Sword Lesbians. It's a game of queer romance and love and action. And in that game, lots of things happen while characters are crossing swords, but it's not always damage. It could be flirting. And characters can do moves, actions called offer emotional support. Right? So the game design how you work the game can really help in these in doing the work of therapy or spirituality. Let's see if I wanted to mention one more game. No, that's it. Also, in Thirsty Sword Lesbians, in a lot of games, we have what are called safety mechanics. They're where players can set up things they do and don't want to be in the game. Like, I don't want there to be homophobia in this game at all. So then we say that's a line, no homophobia allowed in the game. Could be, there can be abuse in the game, but I never want to see it happening on screen, so to speak, right? So if games like Thirsty Sword Lesbians feature, like on page 10, right, and maybe even mention on page 3 that they're going to be there, they feature these safety mechanics. So they help you set up an environment of gameplay that is going to be safer, ways that if something comes up in the game that you don't want, you can, there's an X card thing, or you can make an X to your fingers where you can say, this is out of the game, or you can say, let's just fast forward past this thing I didn't know I didn't want to deal with. So creating safety allows for real deep work to happen. Also, in some games, you advance when you fail, right? Dungeons and Dragons, you advance when you succeed. But in some games, when you fail to do things, that's when you get experience points. Experience points are one way of measuring moving forward. So having a game that's advanced by succeed versus advanced by failure, some games have both, right? But advancing by failure really can help us learn about what does it mean to failure, and that really there's no such thing as failure. Every failure is really an opportunity to learn and grow. But also, I said D&D has these ways of gaining experience points, but you can also easily I can use Dungeons and Dragons for this work. And I do run Spiritual Discovery Dungeons and Dragons group where people come and play. We put a lot of intention into the character. Then we play together, and we start with an opening ritual, usually a little bit of meditation and some intentions you bring to the game. We end also with a little meditation and some moments of gratitude for your play, for other people's play, and what you want to take with you. So I do, and then in between games, if people want, they can have one-on-one sessions with me to go deeper into what the character is, what they're learning from their character, how they're growing and changing. So even D&D works for this work, but I end up dropping some of the rules and mechanics left and right and just not rolling as often. But it has the benefit that people know the game, so it's easier to introduce people to. So for Dream Chaser, let's see how we're doing well on time. It's one-on-one in 1 hour long sessions where people either make themselves as a character or they make a fantastic character. They can play themselves literally. Like I had a person who her goal in the game was to bring spirituality into her daily life. Right, that was her goal. And the steps along the way were various ideas of how she could do that. She was studying to be a minister. She wanted more spirituality in her life. It could be study the Christian scriptures. It could be study other traditions, practices. And we spent 6 weeks going through the possibilities and talking about them when she came in, when we met on video every time. And so I want to give you just a little peek at what it's like to do, what we might do if you came for a first session, where we do a bit of an assessment using a character sheet. So I'm just going to share screen for a moment so you get a visual sense, but because I don't want people to lose the interpreter. So let me see where my share screen option is. I thought I could do that.
Any chance you can hold it up? Or that won't work because it's on your computer?
I have a light copy. It won't really help, but anyway, I won't share it because I didn't make sure I could. Anyway, so what I want you to do is imagine we've come together. We maybe started with a meditation like we did. I'm going to ask you, this is a self-assessment, and it'll help us get to whether or not you're going to play yourself as a character, or whether you would play a fantastic character, whether you would play a wizard or a fighter pilot, you know, in a Star Wars-like setting. Think of yourself and think of 3 adjectives, 3 tags, as we say in games, that describe you. Are you calm, creative, boisterous? You know, just take a moment. If we were together, we'd actually be writing them down to keep a record of this. In the game, if we ever use dice, you could say, hey, I said I was creative. I get to re-roll some dice, right? And now think of 3 strategies, 3 skills that you, the real person you, has, that you use to get in life. And you can rank them as the best, expert, skilled, and beginner. Just kind of think about them now. Again, in session, we take a little more time, and I'd be discussing this with you, and some people might like, I don't know what they are. And I'd say, well, what do you do to pay the bills? Is that a real skill you have, you know, that thing, or is it just a job? Now, I want you to think about how you approach the world. Do you use these skills in pretty standard ways? You know, if you're an architect, do you draw architectural plans, right? Do you use your skill in cooking to cook, right? And then how much do you use them in out of the box ways? As an architect, maybe you could argue with me that if I see a schematic for a circuit board, I can have a pretty good shot of reading it because I know how to read diagrams. That's a little bit out of the box. Or cooking, you know, I know chemistry, so I know cooking, so I might know a little about chemical reactions, you know, because I know how, when you mix things together, what happens if you do it in the wrong order, or you put, you know, baking powder instead of baking soda, you know. How much you get 10 points to divide between reason, which is straightforward, and imagine. So are you more a straightforward thinker or more out of the box thinker, or are you equal in those 2? Are they 5 and 5? Or is one much higher than the other, 6 and 4, you know, 4 and 6? And what we would do is in sessions, we would revisit these, and it might be each session you would feel it was a little different, you know. Next is your health. You have health in mind, body, and spirit. And you have 12 points to divide between those. So right now, are you feeling equally healthy in mind, body, spirit? Are you feeling physically depleted? You know, distribute those 12 points between mind, body, and spirit. And again, we would also revisit this each time you came in, and it might change. And then I would ask about relationships. Who are some important people in your life? And give me one way to describe them, because that's good to know. And then we would get into talking about what's your goal? What's your dream? What are you working on? Are you here because you lost your job and you don't know who you are anymore? Are you here because you are in seminary and you're like, I'm going to be a clergy, and I don't believe in God, you know, and you want to really work through that? Are you here because you just want a deeper connection to God, nature, the universe, the force, whatever you call it? And we would work that out, and we would decide, are we going to play yourself as just you? Or are we going to make a character who can embody these ideas, and then we could play through it like the person did with her blind oracle? So that's just a hint of how an assessment works and how I'd work with you if you were coming to me to do one-on-one work. So I know I threw a lot at you in the last 40 minutes, but I do want to leave plenty of time for some questions. So it's now, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. I might see you on one of the 2 screens.
I'm going to start with one question, and then we'll let people start to chime in. If someone wants to start playing a game for spiritual exploration and healing, how would you get started?
someone wants to play a game, well,
With that in mind, spiritual exploration and healing.
well, you can do it yourself anytime, right? When we play games, we almost automatically, without even thinking about it, put ourselves into our character. Especially a lot of beginning players make characters who are like themselves. But we also just as much make a character who's not like ourselves. But if you wanted to do some spiritual exploration through games, contact me and we can talk about what that could look like.
Speaking of that, do you do actually Dungeons and Dragons workshops virtually these days?
Everything is virtual these days. Everything is on Zoom and on other platforms like Discord or Roll20, which are gaming platforms.
Very cool. Anybody out there want to ask a question directly? And we have another list of some interesting ones.
I see one here. It says, as a gamer starting seminary in the fall, what would you suggest as ways to weave playing games into spiritual formation? Well, if you have a group that you're gaming with, especially of fellow students, do you have a group? I can see you say yes or no. You don't. Yeah. So finding a group would be a great place to start. And you can make you can do this without we don't want people to throw their garbage into just a regular game, right? Their questions and whatnot. But you could play a character, just kind of quietly play a character who's examining whatever the question is that you have, and so if it's a question about formation as future clergy, you could play someone. Cleric is an easy choice, right? You could play someone who's you could also play someone who's from a family of clergy and is refusing to go that route, right? And so you could play characters that somehow have something to do with the element of serving and being a clergy person. Could join one of my games, not to do too much of a commercial, but I'm playing games with people who are exploring these kind of things.
You see, Michael asked, is there a specific Jewish game, maybe something that's out of Israel or a Kabbalah?
Well, there are some specifically Jewish games. What comes to mind right away is this game, Dream Askew, Dream Apart. And it's 2 games in 1 book. Dream Askew is a queer community surviving as the apocalypse happens. And Dream Apart is Jewish fantasy of the shtetl. And this is, and Yona's making some comments here with more information. This game plays without a game master. Everybody who plays is a player and builds the world together, and there's mechanisms for how decisions are made and how conflict is created and resolved. So it's written by Michael Rosenbaum. So it's one explicitly Jewish game that I know off the top of my head. There are some others. There's a couple of games that talk about that incorporate. There's a lot of games that incorporate Kabbalistic ideas and the golems and whatnot. I'm just taking a quick look over my shoulder. I have Monster Hearts that Jackie mentioned earlier. Those are the explicit. And there are a couple of Facebook groups on Jewish role-playing games and Jewish role-playing game design that people talk about them.
So Kat asked, what advice, and she actually had a group of her, she runs a gaming group on Tuesday nights, and here she is. She asked, what advice do you have for a DM who has players, tell us what a DM is, I just want to make sure, who has players interested in using a campaign for spiritual exploration? That's a loaded question for those of us who don't understand this.
Mm-hmm. So when I define spirituality as, questions of who I am, what my purpose is in the world, what my relationship is with the divine, any character can be designed wants to answer those questions. Now, as long as your people are knowing that the dungeon master is not necessarily a professional in spirituality or therapy, You have to be clear that this is what is or isn't happening, what the setup is. But anyone, you could just make the character with these questions, with these personality traits, with these quirks. When it's D&D, there's with a flaw that relates to these things.
Did that answer your question, Kat? Or do you have any added, if you have something to add to that? By the way, thank you, she says. Can we ask Menachem to put contact info in the chat, as well as info about the Jewish Facebook groups, gaming groups you mentioned? So if you have time for that, and when we send something out post, we can add that. But if you can put that in there, how to contact you so they can ask more specific questions.
I will definitely share my contact information, and I'll see if I can find those groups fast enough to put the links in for you. But
so one other question somebody said was, what happens during a turn, as in taking turns?
So turns in games vary, but usually you get into a situation. You're having a conversation with somebody, you encounter someone or a monster who wants to maybe hurt you. And so turns are way different games. Each game has different ways of how you take turns, how you make how you discern whom gets to take an action when. Right? I guess in the Doctor Who game, it's the fighters go last, right? In Dungeons and Dragons, you roll a die and called initiative, and the higher your number, the people at the highest numbers and then moving down go first in a turn, and including the monsters or the enemies you're fighting.
There's actually Jackie asked, is learning an experience gained by fails? You mentioned that, but maybe it's how is learned versus successes in Dungeons and Dragons. Where's failure fit in all of this?
Well, I think in my real life, if I try and do something, like when I was running my spiritual groups for my internship, I mostly learned what not to do, right? Because I wanted to get the young people out of institutional spaces, and we went to cafes. But sitting in meditation for a couple minutes, even in a cafe, is awkward and weird. And it was just too distracting in general to be in the cafe for the kind of work I was doing. So I failed in that regard, so I learned what to do by failing. And I'm not sure I fully grokking the question, but when you fail in some of these games is when you say, I'm going to do something, and you roll a failure, you get a chance to literally get points that help you advance in the game and get more spells or more powers.
There's a word you said before, I can imagine myself being this thing people don't see me as when you're playing, whether you're failing or succeeding. And I found that the word tonight, which is so illuminated for me, is imagination. I mean, if there's anything, you use the word there, but I just, even before this started tonight, at the top of my notes when it said imagination. And I had no idea. Tell us a little bit about, is that word used a lot? I mean, it's obviously imbued in all of this.
Well, I use it a lot in my game work and my spiritual work. Because if you remember during the meditation, I said, imagine this is happening, right? Imagine the flames coming towards you. And I like to say there's no such thing as just imagination, right? In order to do spiritual things, in order to do mystical acts, and meditations, we need to imagine it, right? And our brain doesn't science, I need to read more on this, doesn't know the difference between fiction and fact, right? So when we have an emotional experience based on an imaginary character, our brain still processes it emotionally and learns from that experience and has a real experience. So imagination is, I say, it's our most powerful muscle.
Oh,
one of my favorite.
Imagination is a most powerful muscle. That's beautiful.
And by the way, Todd has put the Facebook groups in the chat for people who are wondering. Thank you, Todd.
Wow. Thank you for that. Did somebody else? So another, you did use the term God, I think once or twice at least. Is that a word, or are there other words that come up like higher power or source or the universe? how does God weave into this whole spiritual aspect of gaming? Is it an okay word to use?
Well, in a lot of games, there are gods, right? There are pantheons of gods, like the Greek gods, Zeus, Aphrodite, Hermes, and other ones that are invented for the games. So yeah, people talk about gods in the games because characters worship, Greek gods, for example. My favorite word for the divine is the infinite eternal, because in the Hebrew name of God, Yod He Vav He, you can spell is, was, will be. And so God is all time and beyond all times. So I like to say infinite eternal.
When you say in Yud He Vav He, you can spell is, was, will be, do you mean they're literally incorporated in the letters?
Literally the Hebrew letters Yud, He, and Vav. You can spell the Hebrew was, is, will be. Technically it's he was, he is, he will be, but it's not necessarily required to say that for this purpose.
Very cool. Infinite, somebody, yes, they like infinite eternal. Yes, it's beautiful. So one other question. Do you think processing deeper questions happens rather during or after we play?
On a mechanical level, I don't like to interrupt the game for tell me about your mothers, right? I don't want to put people's stuff on the table for everybody, but I believe the players are having things happen during the game. I like to do the deeper processing during one-on-one sessions.
Right. Well, you did put how people can reach you. You put your, did we see your contact info?
I'm getting to that. I'm going to.
And thank you, Ben Abrams, for Yud He Vav and Yud He Vav He. Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to close with? Is there anything you want people to leave with to sort of encapsulate what you said?
Oh, I hadn't thought of a closing statement.
That's good. It'll be what comes to you from your imagination, Rabbi Menachem.
Yeah, I always like to close worship with a blessing. This isn't quite worship, but may we all be blessed.
Well, this was a blessing.
Wait, the words are coming. Howard Thurman was a spiritual advisor for Martin Luther King Jr. and many members of the civil rights era. And he said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. Mm. May we all be blessed to find what makes us come alive and the wherewithal to do it, to manifest it. And may our spiritual pursuits, whether through games, through meditation, through prayer, may they help us in this quest. Amen. I'm going to put my contact information and a link to my, I'm starting a newsletter. It's going to be once or twice a month, a couple of paragraphs and some links. I'm going to put a sign up for the newsletter in the chat. I'll put my website also in the chat.
Well, I will say amen to that. And really, this has been so wonderful. And we really want to thank you for delivering this extraordinary perspective for those who are familiar with gaming. One person wrote that they have, they're a gamer, but this was a new perspective for them. And for all of you who have joined us this evening, and for you who join us in the future from the recording, thank you so much. We're so excited to have you here. And we are so grateful to you, Rabbi Menachem. Who knew that gaming could stretch your consciousness and bring you closer to the infinite eternal? And we hope our listeners have gained this new perspective and leave inspired. I'm sure they will. We are very grateful to Kathy. Her signing is an art in and of itself. It is absolutely beautiful, and she does the most magnificent, caring, heartfelt job. So thank you for that. We hope you'll participate in the upcoming 3 events of this spirituality series. The next one is Tuesday, March 23rd with Rabbi Daniel Vaisreb, who will be speaking about exploring the mystical teachings of Rabbi Abraham Maimonides. All events are included in the invitation you received. You'll get it again. Please register. As you know, there's no cost to this. Bring your family and friends. And of course, they're all recorded so you can listen again, or if you miss something, you can do it again. Hebrew Seminary is on our own quest. Well, it's a quest with you in the community to raise awareness about our school, its wealth of offerings, both for rabbinic students and for those of you just interested in learning. And so please visit our website, HebrewSeminary.org, and learn more about what we're offering, all kinds of wonderful things. Of course, we welcome your support. Your support is critical to our functioning and doing all we do, so we continue the important work of educating rabbis as Jewish leaders, serving the hearing impaired and the deaf. And also, as you certainly saw tonight, one of our own rabbinic ordinates is a spiritual guide on all kinds of levels. So thank you again for being here. We wish you the best of health. We wish you abundant blessings flowing your way. And we thank you again for being here. It's a joy to be with you. Thank you. And thank you, Menachem. It's wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. It was an honor. And if anyone is actually using or designing games for spirituality, particularly, please contact me so we can have further conversations. Or if I love having these conversations with people, so I'm very open to further discussion.
Awesome. So much to be learned. And what a beautiful evening. We thank you so much. We will be in touch. And thank you, everybody. Feel free to write in on the website and with Menachem's information. We know he'd love to hear from you.
We'll leave the Zoom up for another minute or so, just so you can go back and get the contact information out of the chat if you need it.
I'm just taking a peek. Lots of thank yous to you.
Yeah, the recording will be up on the website eventually.
Yeah.
The link to it will be up on the seminary website, and I'll be posting it on my Facebook and my website for sure.
And past events, the one we had last month in January, future ones, and also the summer spirituality series that we had. There were some wonderful things there that the teachings are just so rich. And it's a beautiful thing to see our Judaic traditions. And look, whether you're Jewish or not, all of these things can be meaningful. So we welcome everybody and anybody who wants to join us to learn. We welcome your comments. We welcome your questions. We welcome your suggestions. We're just really grateful you're here. And may you all have sweet dreams and the rest of a beautiful evening, and use your imagination. It beckons for you to do so, to come alive.
Amen.
Thank you.
Have a Freilich Purim, everybody.